Peer Review is a series of podcasts designed to shed light on the extraordinary breadth and diversity of talent that sit in the House of Lords. The House of Lords often gets a bad rap because it is thought to be a house of cronies and it is an unelected house. But I hope through these interviews you will see that there is this extraordinary talent, there is a great knowledge and experience, and with that I leave you to draw your own conclusions. Well, my guest today is Baroness Prashar of Runnymede, which is an interesting combination because obviously Prashar, Indian origin, and Runnymede being the place of great historic interest in the United Kingdom. Usha, you've been in the House of Lords for 24 years now, which is a long time. But I want to go back to where it all started for you, because you were born in Kenya and then moved to Yorkshire. A slight weather difference, I think. But to talk me through what happened, what were the events that stimulated that?
Well, my departure from Kenya was after I finished what in those days were called the O-levels. And I wanted to do my A-levels in Kenya, but it was just before independence. And in those days, there was segregation, not like South Africa, but there was kind of segregation. There was Asian schools, European schools, and the Asian schools did not have facility for A-level. And of course, I wouldn't be accepted in a European school. So I came to Wakefield, Yorkshire, to a direct ground school, the Wakefield Girls' High School.
Did your parents come with you?
No, I came by myself.
My goodness.
Because my...
And you were what, 16 or something?
16. And my brother was a doctor. He'd qualified at Leeds. And there's a difference between him and I of about 12, 13 years.
Right.
And so he was practicing in Yorkshire. So he said, fine. I was always a kind of a favourite kid sister. So I came and went to school and stayed with him and his wife, Brenda. And so I went to school in Wakefield. It was a very interesting experience, Jonathan.
And it was a grammar school, wasn't it?
It was a direct ground school.
And were there a lot of Indians or people from the African continent?
I was about to tell you, it's a very interesting experience because I was the first ever overseas student that had.
Incredible. You were head girl, amazingly.
I was.
And on that sort of topical subject at the moment, did you experience racism? It sounds as if you didn't in the slightest.
I didn't. As I said, I was a novelty. And what was very interesting, that I was just appointed. I mean, the head girls were elected. So amazing. I was elected by my peers to become a head girl for third year. So that was fantastic. And funny enough, I came here with the interest to do something like domestic science. I was very keen on interior decoration and all of that. And both my brother and the headmistress said to me, with O-levels like this, Usha, you can pursue that as a hobby, do something different. So I went to Leeds University from there.
And did politics?
And did politics and sociology, yes, indeed.
Amazing. And you alluded a moment ago to India. I always find it interesting, and particularly with you, is that you're from Kenya, but obviously from Indian parents, but very much in your DNA, despite having spent virtually all your life in the UK, is India.
Well, again, as I said, in East Africa, your upbringing was very Indian. You spoke your own mother tongue in the home. And I alluded to segregation. The segregation was there. There was Europeans, Asians, and Africans. And the only interaction you probably had with the Africans, where they were there to help in the home. But one thing I do remember, that my father and my brother, who invited me to come here, were the only people who actually had Africans coming home and sitting at the same dining table eating with us. So for me, the whole issue of equality was very much part of that. But your upbringing is very Indian. So culturally, you could say I'm Indian, but I love Africa.
And you're married to an Indian?
I'm married to an Indian.
And did you meet Usha here, or did you meet him?
I met him here in London because he came to UK 2 years before me. 62, I came in 64. Our families knew each other, but we didn't know each other because there's a 5-year difference. So he came after having done his A-levels to study law here. He studied in London. I was in Leeds, but we met in London.
Mm. Looking at your amazing CV, there's one thing that stands out, which is you were chairman of the Parole Board, pretty young age of 49. since 99, when you reached the Lords, there's been this sort of incredible explosion of your CV in theory. But I'd like to just find out a bit more about what happened up to 97 and 99, for that matter, when you became chairman of the Parole Board, and what was the background to it?
I think my early years are very formative here. When I said I was in Wakefield and in Leeds, if I may just give you a little bit of an insight into that, my sister-in-law, Brenda, was a health visitor. And at that time, a lot of the migrants were coming from Mirpur. And she, of course, didn't speak the language, and I did. So I went around with her interpreting, because I could speak.
Brenda was British, was she?
Brenda was English.
Right.
So I got an insight into the issues facing early migrants and became very interested in that area. So when I went to Leeds University, I became involved again in the campaign against racial discrimination and taught English to Indian women who would come there. So that was part of my extracurricular activity. But I was very active at Leeds, was a pretty swinging university in the 60s. But while I was there, the situation in East Africa changed, because there was 1968. There was Africanization, and then there was the Immigration Act here. So, of course, I couldn't go back because my mother and father retired and went back to India. So I stayed on. I did international relations and politics with a view to going back. So I changed course and then decided to go to Glasgow University, and I did social administration. And that was interesting because I had a wonderful tutor, K. Carmichael, who was someone who actually lived in the Gorbals on Social Security to see what it was like to live on Social Security. And she did a lot of work with women in prisons and so on. So those are the kind of early influences. And that got me interested that I wanted to work in race relations. So my very first job was as a conciliation officer with the then Race Relations Board. And the two significant things I really want to point out, which I'm very proud of, I led the investigation into dispersal in education. Now, very few people know that busing happened in the UK, because in 1965, Edward Boyle, when he went to Southall, parents complained, that a lot of Asians are coming in, our schools are getting saturated, the standards are low. So he decided children should be dispersed. And so I led that investigation because nobody would complain, but there was a single provision in the Race Relations Act that you could initiate an investigation. So what I did, you wouldn't believe, I walked the streets of Southall, taking evidence from parents about 5 years old being bussed, having to leave home at 7 and coming back at 5, 6 o'clock because they bussed out. So that was...
This is bus to school.
Yeah. Bus to school. So busing was dismantled as a result of that investigation. And while I was there, I was...
But on that subject, how else would they have got to school?
Well, the point is, they were bussed into outside the area.
Right, so they bussed out of the area rather than... so they were... The places were found
the
within...
busing was dispersal, which was away from their sort of area in Southall, going into outer areas, you see. And then at the age of 28, I was headhunted to become the director of the Runnymede Trust.
Yeah.
And I, of course, led Runnymede Trust for 7 years. And during that time, as you know, a lot of the...
And just explain what the Runnymede Trust was.
Runnymede Trust was set up in 1968, following the Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech. Some very key people, Lord Campbell of Ascombe, Richard Rampton, Jim Rose, Lord Leicester, they actually got together. Sir Peter Medawar, who was a Nobel Prize winner, decided there was a need for an educational body, because in those days, promoting race relations was not a charitable object. So it was established as an educational charity. And I was its fourth director, because Deepak Nandi was one, Dave Stevens and Tom Rees. And my period there coincided. I worked very closely with Anthony Lester on the 1976 anti-discrimination legislation. I was there when the Scarman report, when the uprisings happened in 1982. But that was, in a way, a good insight into broader public policy, because it wasn't an area that didn't touch, whether it was education or whatever. So when I was there, I recognized that if I wanted to mainstream the issues of discrimination inclusion into the policy structure, I needed to mainstream myself. So I couldn't continue to work in very specific bodies. So I took 2 years out and went to be a senior fellow at the Policy Studies Institute. And I did a piece of research on primary health care, because I wanted to see how you bring about organizational change and implementation of policy and compare that as common. And I wrote a book with Professor Ken Young on primary health care in London.
Yeah.
And from then, of course, I applied to be the director of the National Council for Voluntary Organizations. And that, to me, was my first step into what I call mainstreaming myself.
Yeah, and mainstream public service. Precisely.
And NCVO, as you know, is an umbrella body for all the non-for-profit organizations. The comparable, you could say, is the CBI for the voluntary sector. It was a breakthrough in a way. They've never had a woman director. They've never had somebody of my kind of heritage. And so I ran the NCVO for 5 years, from 1986 to 91. And again, that coincided with the very interesting developments because there was a view by the then government, Mrs. Thatcher, that not-for-profit organizations should only be service delivery. They shouldn't campaign. They wanted to change the charity law, community care. They wanted to improve the efficiency, effectiveness, So I kind of was right in the center of some of the policy changes. And I also take the view that voluntary sector isn't a career as such. You come in, you do your bit, and then you move away. So after 5 years, I then had a very interesting portfolio of things to do. I was appointed to be on the Runciman Commission, which was the Royal Commission on Criminal Justice, which was chaired by Lord Runciman. I was appointed on the Lord Chancellor's Advisory Committee on Legal Education and Conduct. And Kenneth Baker asked me to be a non-exec of Channel 4. And I also...
A man of great vision, Ken.
Absolutely. And I actually also was asked, this is an interesting thing, if I would chair United Kingdom Immigrants Advisory Service. And I said to the Home Office, no, I don't want to chair it. What I will do is do an analysis for you, because when that organization was set up, immigration was a big issue. That has changed. It's now mainly refugees. So I actually chaired a panel, and I said I will do it if I can choose the people who can be on my panel. So I did a piece of work for the Home Office, which led to dismantling of United Kingdom Immigrants Advisory Service and formed 2 organizations, Refugee Legal Centre and the Immigrants Advisory Service. So that was kind of the pieces of work that I
and then the Parole Board job became available. And clearly all this was incredible training.
So this was, and I also became involved in Salzburg Seminars, which is now another international body where I did a lot of work on non-governmental organizations and democracy, because the change was taking place in Europe and South Africa. Then I was ready to do another big challenge. So I applied to be I think what is significant is that by this time, the Nolan principles had kicked in.
Yeah.
And prior to me being...
You just need to say what the Nolan principles were.
As you know, this was about, integrity in public life.
Yeah.
And they had said that all the public bodies should now be appointing people through open competition. So when the Parole Board job came, I applied, because prior to that, it had only been a kind of a sinecure for junior Home Office ministers. Lord Belstead was my predecessor. I applied, and lo and behold, I won the competition and became the first appointed chairman of the Parole Board. And again, that was, as you can imagine, it's a very tough job. But
What were the main issues that...
Well, one of the two things which I feel I should point out to you that I did. One was that there was a backlog of cases. Only 25% of people were getting their cases heard in time. Otherwise, they were languishing in prison. And secondly, there was a push to make the parole board very adversarial. They wanted to bring up lawyers in. So I said, fine. I mean, to cut a very long story short, I changed the whole thing. And by the time I left, 98% of the people heard their decisions on time.
So you'd become a peer in 1999, as I'd referenced earlier. And from then on, in some ways, it all kicked off because you ended up with a multitude of involvements in the public sector. And in many ways, I think peerage must have helped all this. Just to knock off a few before we get into the detail of them, you became, as you say, the first Civil Service Commissioner, first chair of the Judicial Appointments Commission. You were involved in the Iraq inquiry, which we're going to come to in a minute. You were deputy chairman of the British Council. You were president of the Royal Commonwealth Society, where you and I have enjoyed conversation. You were chair of the Natural Literacy Trust.
I set it up.
And Every Child Matters. There's a sort of whole range of things. But let's just explain what the first Civil Service Commission, the Civil Service Commission does, and you were the first.
Yeah. Now, before I go to that, I think I should point out to you that I had actually started doing public service well before I became a peer, because
yes, I did.
I was appointed, in fact, on the Social Security Advisory Committee, and I served on the Arts Council. I was the youngest member of the Arts Council from 1979 to 82. So I'd already started doing all of that. And the National Literacy Trust, I should say, again, I'm very proud of it. When I left the NCVO, Sir Simon Hornby, who was then the chairman of W.H. Smith, was leaving, and he wanted to kind of leave a legacy. He got hold of me through headhunters and said, would you help me set up the National Literacy Trust? For me, it was a dream come true. I love reading. I just finished the NCVO, and I thought, right, this is the way to do it. So we established the National Literacy Trust, which today, if I may say so, starting with 3 people, is now a 10 million turnover, a
Amazing.
Very effective body.
And you were chair from 2009.
Yeah, I was deputy with Simon, then I became chair. I'm now the president. So sorry about that.
But go back to the Civil Service Commission. What does that do?
The role of the Civil Service Commissioner is to help maintain the impartiality of the civil service by ensuring that appointments to the civil service are made through fair and open competition and on merit. And this, as you know, was something which was set up by Northcote Trevelyan to do away with patronage and increase the effectiveness of the civil service.
Well, effective, providing you got the choice right.
Well, absolutely. And I'm very proud of it because, again, I think from the time I was there, from 2000, 2005, it was the Blair government. There was an explosion of special advisors. There was a kind of a push to change the whole thing. So again, I had to position it to say, look, maintaining the impartiality is not incompatible with increasing the effectiveness of the civil service. So I worked with 3 cabinet secretaries, Richard Wilson, Andrew Turnbull, and Gus O'Donnell. And I think we managed to maintain the boundaries. Because if I look at my career, I think my job has been policing the boundaries in the broader constitutional sense.
And then you became chairman of the Judicial Appointments Commission, which kind of speaks for itself. So you're responsible for appointing the judges.
Well, that was, again, I was inaugural chair of the Judicial Appointments Commission.
Yes.
It was set up following the 2005 Constitutional Reform Act. And again, that was not only setting it up, but changing the culture, because intellectually, both the Lord Chancellor and the judges knew why there was a need, but emotionally they couldn't let go of the patronage. And they'd also made the change that it needed to increase the pool from where judges were drawn, both in terms of solicitors and not Oxbridge and minorities. So I always used to say it was like, living in a house while you're building it. So basically setting it all up and actually changing and implementing the aspirations of the
as you alluded, these are all changes in the way of government that it no longer became patronage, it became application. I think part of the problem we have now is that a lot of people in their right minds wouldn't apply for these jobs because the scrutiny is just unbelievable.
Well, I suppose in both, yes, you're right, but that's for public appointments. But I think for judges and civil servants, I think with judges, the issue really is that if you are a young commercial barrister at the bar, you have to toy with the idea of whether you actually give up a lucrative practice to become a judge. Yeah. And with women, the issue is different because you see a lot of women entering the legal profession, both as solicitors and at the bar. But attrition happens when they go and have children and come back. Integration is different. I mean, that's an ongoing issue. But I think on the whole, this has been a good change. But I think the only reservation I have, I tried very hard to position the Judicial Appointments Commission as a constitutional body and not just a recruitment body. Because how judges are selected is very important.
Yeah.
Because if you want independent judiciary, the selection has to be seen to be independent.
In 2009, you joined the Iraq inquiry, which is probably similar to the COVID inquiry. You know, it took years. It was a huge amount of work and paper and research, etc. Just talk us through that inquiry and what effect it had on you.
But unlike the COVID inquiry, the Iraq inquiry was an inquiry by a kind of Privy Council inquiry. So we were all made Privy Councillors. And the objective was to basically describe what happened and what lessons could be learned. And there were 5 of us on that inquiry. And learning about the sort of, in terms of what lessons could be learned, it was very important to establish what actually happened. And we were quite determined that we did not want lawyers involved, because the minute you get lawyers involved, you become adversarial. People think it's kind of a blame culture. That wasn't the objective. It was tough, but I really enjoyed it. It was very time consuming. There was a lot of media scrutiny. We took a lot of flack. But what I enjoyed about it were 2 things. One, the colleagues were fantastic. And I think all of us got on really well, which was a good thing. But the actual insight into what happened was good. And it played some of the interest I had, which was machinery of government was my main interest. Having been a civil service commissioner, I had a very good ringside view of how things operate. And some of the mistakes which happened over the Iraq inquiry were to do with machinery of government. In a way, if you compare to COVID, it's a relationship between the scientific advisors and ministers, and here was the intelligence services and ministers. So why it took so long? Well, in a way, if you do a PhD and you're covering, almost about 7-8 years, it takes a long time. But ours took longer for 2 reasons. One was we had quite a discussion with the government, the then government, on wanting to declassify cabinet minutes, because we thought we couldn't tell the full story until all the cabinet minutes that we thought were relevant, properly redacted, could be made public. Secondly, we also wanted to reveal the telephone conversations that took place between Bush and Blair. Now, that took almost 2 years of negotiation. But we were not willing to do that because we could not tell the full story. The second issue, which wasn't so much of the time, is what is called the maximalization process, which is that if you are going to say anything about anybody in the report, you've got to give them the opportunity to see what we've said. Not so much in terms of what our comments were, whether the story was accurate. And I think, retrospectively, there's a good thing to have done, because if you didn't do maximalization, you could have had judicial reviews afterwards. People have said, you've actually said not accurate things about us. So I think it was, on the whole, a good exercise. And I think people forget that it's a sign of a very robust democracy that we can lay ourselves open to that kind of scrutiny. Same applies to COVID. And the number of Americans who said to us, we wish we could have an inquiry like that. So I think we're very good at beating ourselves here, but I think it's a sign of a pretty robust democracy, which says, yes, we're going to have an examination. The only sad thing was that we slightly got overshadowed because of Brexit, because, it happened about the same time.
Depending on which side of the fence you're on, I guess.
No, it's not whether you're pro or anti-Brexit.
No, it's not about that. It's whether you were involved in the Iraq War or
but for my point, yes, exactly. But the point was, lessons learned for government departments were substantial. I think some lessons have been learned, but I'm not sure they are, because I do get sometimes very frustrated. Oh, it took so long. And I always used to say to them, look, we will do a good job, but tell me, are you actually strong enough to implement the changes? And it was very sad that even the Public Administration Select Committee in the House of Commons, had Chilcot before them after it was published. All they questioned him was why there was a delay. They did not concentrate on what lessons could be learned. Here's a Public Administration Select Committee. They should have looked at that. So I'm just hoping that they will also pay heed to the COVID inquiry lessons.
And you must have formed your own personal views on the Iraq situation.
When you say personal, I mean, they were very much informed on evidence. Ours was a very evidence-based inquiry. And I think we all decided that we were not going to talk about it after it's been published, because what is said, it's there. We signed up to it. And I think it's a it's a very accurate picture of what happened. And I think from my point of view, it's a question of learning about machinery of government, interventions. I mean, they're big issues, which we haven't got time to go through.
You and I have spent a lot of time working on Commonwealth things. You were president of the Royal Commonwealth Society. Where do you see the Commonwealth going, in short? Does it have a future?
I think it has a future. Its future depends on two things. How far we build the infrastructure of the non-governmental Commonwealth. As you know, I feel passionately about that. Because I think Commonwealth was set up as a people's Commonwealth, and we sometimes forget that. As far as the heads of government and the Commonwealth Secretariat is concerned, as you well know my views, I think it needs a massive reform if it's got to remain relevant. So I think it's an organization which has an enormous potential, which hasn't always been realized. But I think it'd be a pity if we didn't work hard to maintain it, to increase its effectiveness. But I find it very frustrating that, to me, it's blindingly obvious what needs to happen. But nobody's kind of gripping it. But
that's a third of the world's population, huge youth.
Absolutely.
70%
I'm not saying it to you, but I think what you've done through on business and investment, I think is an example of what can be done.
Yeah. Well, thank you for saying that. Just as we conclude, Usha, you're a crossbencher. You're probably not a huge fan of this government, but you enjoy the impartiality of crossbencher, and you're still very active in the Lords.
Yes.
And why?
I think it's a privilege to be there. And if you have a position where you feel you can actually influence, two things I enjoy the most. One is select committees. Ever since I've been in the House of Lords, I've always done a select committee.
And the select committees are ones that review legislation, that come out with reports on future of whatever select committee you're on.
We basically do inquiries. I mean, currently I sit on the Justice and Home Affairs, and we are doing an inquiry into community sentencing, but we keep an eye on what's happening. I chaired the subcommittee of the European Union Home Affairs Committee, and there the role was to actually scrutinize directives and legislation coming out of Europe, but also doing our own inquiries. So I've done several of those, and I find that very interesting. Yeah. And I think it's good to be able to also influence legislation where your areas of interest are. And I think some general debates, which you and I have actually contributed to, I think is useful to raise some of these issues. So, and I think it's an essential part of our sort of constitutional arrangement. You know, if we're a scrutinizing house, I think we've got to take that responsibility seriously. And I'm one of these people, I do believe, if you're given a responsibility, you've got to really do it with dedication.
Well, that's eminently apparent in all your life to date. And there's still a long way to go.